And we're just very, very, I am just so excited to have Dr. Gary Habermas here. I've read so many of his books over the years and just been so inspired. And Joshua, do you have anything to add for introduction-wise for maybe some of the students who aren't familiar with him?
Yeah, I do. But first, Ryan, just for Gary's sake, could you talk a little bit about the students and some of them that are in the group right now?
Yeah, so we basically, right before COVID hit, we set up this pathway to a master's degree with God's Bible School and College. And so we do
about 2 years to put together.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we have we have 9 MA level courses, and then God's Bible School and College provides 6 courses, so 15 courses total to get an MA in Christian missions to Muslims and Islamic studies. So what we did was basically in 40 countries, scholarship them top leaders from, denominations, mission organizations, people who can basically drive what we call an Every Muslim for Christ initiative in those different countries. So Indonesia, all over the Middle East.
How many countries are in the program?
All over Africa, about 40 countries right now.
And so Gary, we have like Nabil Qureshi. You're friends with Nabil Qureshi, and a number of the guys in here are former Muslims. Thomas, for example, has the Quran memorized, and so he was a Hafiz and Imam in Egypt, and others that from Syria and other places. So there's former Muslims, there's Christians, there's Christian leaders that have doctorates, there's Christian evangelists that may not have a degree, but they're some of the fieriest evangelists, running crusades throughout Africa and so on. Apologists, some of the best apologists in India, best apologists in Indonesia, Ethiopia, and just across the board. So generally, we're trying to focus on those top leaders and also then therefore bring the top professors in the world. Dr. Gary Habermas, I've known for probably, we were trying to figure it out, maybe 20 years. I started teaching at Biola University in 1999 and began going to the Evangelical Theological Society. And over the last 20 some odd years, Gary has, at least for me, he's represented in the minimal facts argument on the resurrection, the crucifixion, resurrection of Jesus, has represented the kind of the backbone of the 1,000 or so Evangelical Theological Society professors making the strongest case for that. And so he's been a research professor at Liberty University and 15 other schools. He taught at Biola and other places. But that mainly, Gary, he has been such a good friend to me and to others. Nabil Qureshi, David Wood, guys that were just kind of on the margins for a long time because Muslim ministry was so on the margins. Nobody studied it. And 10, 20 years ago. And so Gary would pay attention, and he'd remember us, and he'd talk with us, and he would engage with us and help us. And so he has been that guy for so many different professors, but he not just with the prestigious scholarly guys at the ETS, but guys who are trying to find their way. And so Gary's always been a really good friend. It's his warmth and his friendship has been something that has been outstanding as a Christian. And I know he's going to be that for you guys as well. Here today, Gary, I'm going to give it to you and let you take it away.
Josh, thanks. I have to be careful when I'm introduced. I heard a friend say a long time ago, be careful not to drink the perfume. You can't believe what everybody says. You just have to keep pushing ahead. And first, a disclaimer. I feel like I've got to say this to this group because I understand there may be a chance to do some Q&A afterwards. So I am not a Muslim scholar. I'm far from it. I know almost nothing about it. I'm busy enough just doing the resurrection in its own context, and that's what I do. I'm interested in what we know about the resurrection, and I'll define the minimal facts argument that Josh mentioned just a minute ago, and start with that. And I'll try to lay a groundwork. Let's shoot for 3 different things. The overall topic is the resurrection of Jesus, but within that, I would like to talk about a definition of the gospel. What I'm going to argue, at least three doctrines are present in the definition of the gospel. Not that nothing else ever gets mentioned, but those three are the keys. And one of them is the deity of Christ. I want to talk about that in detail. And thirdly, in order to do any of this, I'm going to have to, let me start by defining an area of evidence that has grown, like your ministry. It's grown very quickly, very fast. And I only teach at the PhD level now. I've got great students, probably anywhere from a third to a half of them are already professors. They come from all over the world. And unfortunately, our classes are really small. That's what they have to be at the PhD level. We have a dozen or 14, and I do 3 of those a year. And when I first brought this up with them, this first topic, it's the background to work into deity and resurrection. I'll mention the death of Jesus too. Those are the 3. But they looked at me like, what? Now, these are PhD students, and we're not doing a very good job getting this first point across. There's an amazing evidence. I'm kind of at the point where I'm willing to say it may be the strongest single area. It is an evidence, but it's the strongest possible area, perhaps, from which we draw these evidences. It's a milieu. And so let me start with that. The New Testament has dozens of little tiny creedal passages. Now, when you think of a creedal passage, you might think of the biggies, Nicaea, Chalcedon, what are called the ecumenical creeds, because they're pretty much shared by Orthodox Christians in whatever branch of Christianity they're in. They share these beliefs. And there are maybe a dozen fundamental beliefs, let's say, in the inner circles of Christianity. And somebody might say to you, well, I don't believe in this about creation, or I'm not a dispensationalist, or I'm not a this, or I'm not a that. But I do believe in the deity of Christ. I do believe Christ died on the cross. I do believe Jesus was raised from the dead. I do believe we can have a relationship with him. I believe in God being 3 persons. I believe, and they go down the line, and those are fundamentals. Well, within these fundamentals, there's an inner circle. If you think of an outer circle called the fundamental doctrines that Christians pretty much agree on, there's an inner circle, which I call the gospel fundamentals. And it's the inner circle because it's probably, I think it is the major theme in the New Testament. And it is a question of, well, let's take the Philippian jailer in Acts. What must I do to be saved? To come to Christ, there's both content and commitment. And when I discuss content and commitment, let me put it, I like to use this illustration. Marriage. Now, I don't know how marriage is performed all over the world, but I've done a fair amount of them, and there's usually thought to be 2 things. You get to know somebody, and people differ on how well you need to know the person. Some people, they stay engaged, or they hang around together, or they're involved for, many years. And then they, quote unquote, tie the knot. They say, I do. That I do is just 2 words, I do. And in a lot of the Western countries, we say, for better or worse, rich and poor, till death do we part. And I do commits a lot of your life across a very broad theme. It commits living with somebody, being tied down, being married, having children, figuring out finances, education, what to do in times of sickness. It's a many, many faceted topic. And yet you get in the door by saying, I do. Well, on the gospel fundamentals there at the beginning, I think the best way to explain belief, the word believe in Greek in the New Testament, pisteuo, the noun, pistis. I've heard critics of Christianity say, I heard one very well-known critic say, It's so easy to get into Christianity. All you got to do is believe. For crying out loud, I believe in all kinds of things. I believe in my favorite kind of ice cream. And that was kind of an American definition because the word believe is such a simple word. Yes, I believe George Washington was the first president of the United States almost 200 years ago. Well, over 200 years ago, that kind of thing. But in the New Testament, which is the language we're talking about, the culture we're talking about, it's not Western or Eastern culture. It's, the Jewish culture in the middle of the world. When you say I do to Jesus, or I should say it this way, believe is a full commitment. It is basically saying I do to Jesus. When I got married, the pastor doing the little sermonette said, Gary, you may as well admit it right now. Everything on from this moment, whatever you have, you think it's private, you think it's yours. From now on, it's hers. And it was kind of shocking to hear him say that. And she lifted her hand up and she went, yes, like that. All right, because she was the committee. I was the committer. Now, she says I do too. But that's what he said to me. And I think that's the best picture because the word believe or commit in the New Testament means to follow. Both John and Peter say we should walk in his steps. Now, somebody might stop me right there and go, whoa, 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 do I detect salvation by works here? And I'd say, well, let me ask you. When you said I do, when you got married, was that by works? And you go, works? No, we hadn't done anything. We're standing up on the stage, we hadn't done anything. But by the time I walked away, I was married. I was committed. Oh, so did you get married by works? No. What did you do? I got married by commitment. I said, I do. That's a commitment. We don't ever ask the question, did you get married by good works? And a person who, thought about this a little bit would say, marriage comes first. You could have done things with the person way before that. You could have walked and talked and got to know. I mean, after all, that's what you're supposed to do, right? But the doing comes after you say, I do. And people have that classic issue with Paul and James. Paul, Ephesians 2, James 2. James says, he didn't say by works. He said, your faith will be made known by your works. Paul says in Ephesians 2, it's often missed, by grace you're saved by faith, not of yourself, not of works. Very next verse, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works. It's a matter of a preposition, as a lot of things are. You're not saved by good works, you're saved unto good works. In fact, my personal belief is what you do for Christ before salvation doesn't, really help you. It might, to use Jesus' words, it might get you fewer lashes. That's nice. But it doesn't get you to heaven, your works. But after you come to Christ, everything you do for Christ, in my book, my view, determines the capacity to which you will enjoy eternity. And you say, well, that sounds like something you cooked up yourself. Well, sort of I did, but in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus said, whoever gives a cup of water to one of these will not lose their reward. If a cup of water or something the equivalent is a work that is rewarded, we have a lot ahead of us. But notice, it's after you've already started following Jesus. He says that to his followers. So just that little introduction, three things in that inner circle, I would say. Minimum of deity, death, resurrection. Whenever the gospel is defined in the New Testament, deity, death, resurrection is arguably present there. And to those three things, if you want to call this a doctrine, to those three things, you append your faith. You're saying I do. Not, look, folks, I love history, okay? I've written, 40-something books, and half of them are on the resurrection. But I don't say yes to the resurrection of Jesus. I say yes to the Jesus who was resurrected. Does that make sense? When you say yes to a person in marriage, you don't say yes to beautiful, smart, really intelligent. We get along. I just like our working together. This person has so many qualities. You don't say yes or I do to qualities. You say yes to a person who has qualities. And when we say I do to Jesus, we say I do to a person who has qualities, or in theology, if you want to be a little more specific, attributes. Now, we have attributes too as human beings, but when you say yes to Jesus, you're saying yes to the one who is deity, who died for us, who was raised from the dead. We're not saying amen. I mean, so, you know what I mean? We sort of are, but we're saying amen to the person who died, not to death per se, not to deity generally, but to the person who is deity. All right, so that's the inner circle. I like the verse in Romans 10:9, and this will get us right into these creeds that I just introduced. Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Think about that reference for a minute. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and you believe in your heart, remember, if you said I do in your heart to the fact that he died and was raised from the dead, you'll be saved. Now, just right after that, Lord can mean different things. Lord can mean sir. Lord can be a boss. Lord could be a judge, Your Honor. But in the New Testament, when it says Jesus is Lord, Paul tells you what the definition is, because right after he quotes Romans 10:9, he quotes the Old Testament, and he quotes the passage, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. The word Lord in that passage is Jehovah. Now, you want to talk about something sobering. That word, whoever calls on the name of the Lord is Jehovah. You go, well, yeah, I know, and that's so holy in the Old Testament. The name of God often wasn't even pronounced. That's correct. But Paul is saying when you believe that Jesus is Lord, that's the kind of Lord he's talking about. The kind of Lord that participates in the Godhead, deity. Now, Josh tells me that you folks have done a lot of studying on Richard Bauckham. Bauckham's argument, Jesus and the God of Israel, is quite profound, but this is one of his major arguments. You know Jesus was believed to be deity because the early Christians used Old Testament verses that applied to Yahweh and applied them to Jesus. And he refers to it as a type of ontological, a big, $2 philosophical term. But ontology has to do with being and metaphysics and who you are and who God is and who I am. Jesus' ontology has to do with identity, according to Bauckham. The New Testament shows Jesus' identity with the Godhead. This is heavy stuff, but it's deity. And death. I just co-authored an article on the death of Jesus for a medical journal, a secular medical journal published our article. And we talked about what is death by crucifixion, what happens, how do you die. I'm getting ready to use some of that material in a lecture coming up here, Lord willing, in a few weeks at one of the seminaries where I'm a visiting professor. And one of the lectures I'm giving is 20 evidences for the crucifixion of Jesus. There are a lot of evidences. Now, remember, the minimal facts argument says I will only use data that critical scholars admit. Well, who's critical scholars? Well, a critical scholar could be a believer, but here's the definition of a critical scholar. A critical scholar is a person who has a terminal degree, usually described as a doctor's degree, in a specific field. In other words, critical scholars on the historical Jesus are specialists on the historical Jesus. You don't have to be a believer. I read more atheist critical scholars, agnostic critical scholars, non-Christian critical scholars. You say, sounds like you're making a judgment. No, they're telling us who they are. And they say, I'm an agnostic, or I'm not a Christian, or I'm Jewish, non-Christian. And other kinds of skeptics, atheists, agnostics, Jewish, other religions, other skeptics. I use their data because they are A, either not Christians or extremely skeptical, and B, admit all my information. So I want to make clear that these 20 evidences for the crucifixion are according to their standards of what makes evidence. For many of our people, you'd argue like this. Well, the book of Matthew says, and Matthew's inspired. The book of John says, and John's inspired. I can't say that with my clientele, and maybe you can't say that with your clientele. I don't know what the people groups that you represent, I don't know what they believe and know, and I'm not a scholar in your guys' area. But I do know that you often have to walk through the hoops of using their definition of data in order to have the right to present your facts. They don't agree with that if it's not according to their culture and their history and their so on. So that's how I do the minimal facts. And everything you hear me do from this point on is going to be agreed to by the vast majority of critical scholars who study the historical Jesus. Now, back to my comment, Matthew says, John says. I can't argue like that. I have to take special passages in John, special passages in Matthew, and tell the critic why those passages meet the mark, the evidential mark that they accept. Then they go, oh, well, hey, go ahead. And then I can use passages. One small example. In Matthew chapter 11, it's also in Luke. This is the material we call Q. Josh, I don't know how much you've gotten into this, and I don't want to start a big thing here. But when I talk about the Q material in New Testament, the gospel sources are designated by names. And Q, I am not talking about whether there was an ancient book of sayings of Jesus. That's fine. If they're actual sayings of Jesus, that's fine, but that's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that there are passages, very simply, definition, there are passages that are in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Those are called Q passages. Critics often teach them. Critics. Now see, this isn't my view, but I have to use their data. They often tell you that Q passages are the earliest and best passages there are. Well, guess what? In Matthew 11 and in Luke, but not in Mark, Jesus makes a statement that sounds like John. Critics often don't like John, but they're fine when Matthew and Luke say it and Mark doesn't, because it's an early Q saying. And it goes like this, paraphrasing. Jesus, and we're talking about the deity of Christ too, right here. I'm using my examples that got to get across some of these areas. Okay, Jesus says, no one knows the Son but the Father, and no one knows the Father but the Son, and those to whom he will reveal them. Well, that's not that you go. Now, if you knew your Bible pretty well, but you didn't know that was in Matthew, you might go, hey, I hear John there. Where is that in John? It's not. Matthew and Luke. So it's often called by critics, it's called the Johannine thunderbolt. Or as I think it's Ben Witherington, a well-known New Testament scholar, as Witherington says, it's not a thunderbolt, it's a lightning strike. Thunder doesn't do much. Lightning does. And for Matthew and Luke to speak like Jesus said, no one knows me but the Father, and no one knows the Father but me. That's pretty radical. Yeah, well, we don't accept that stuff. It's pretty late. That's in John. Nope, it's not. It's in Q. It's in the earliest passages. That's an example of using critical scholars. Now, see, someone's not going to argue with me. A Christian's not going to argue with me. They'll say, no, don't use the Bible like that. Don't use Matthew 11. Of course they'll let me use Matthew 11. But I'm majoring in the verses that the critics will use. So that's the minimal facts method. I'll use their data, and I'm going to try to show you today that the resurrection happened with data they allow. How many of them? How many scholars? I would say of the half dozen facts I use, they're probably agreed to by 90-something% of the skeptics. I don't care. I'd rather read atheists, agnostics, non-Christian New Testaments. If they've got to be specialists. They can't be people running around saying, I know the Bible. They've got to be specialists and have terminal degrees, and they will grant you this material. All right, that's the minimal facts argument. Now, and I mentioned a little bit about the deity. I mentioned Romans 10:9, mentioned Matthew 11. Let me tell you why Romans, you can tell why Matthew would be authoritative if it was said, because it was said by Jesus. But Romans 10:9 was something Christians made up later. Why is Romans 10:9 authoritative. Okay, now this is going specifically to the creeds topic. I've defined minimal facts. Let me go straight to the creeds. This is one of the three topics I want to do today. The minimal facts is my method. The three topics are creeds, say a little bit more about deity, and resurrection. Creeds. Very early, when Christ died, usually put at 30 AD, the second most popular year, maybe you're surprised it's not 29 or 31. The second most popular year is 33, because you got to get the moon right for the Passover. So, but 30 is the general date. It's usually used by people. They don't waste time arguing about what the year is. It doesn't make any difference. Whatever happened when it did, and we go from that point on. Okay. Traditionally, that's the AD BC, but, we've gotten away from that. At least a lot of scholars have. Okay, so this all happened in 30 AD. The cross happened in 30 AD. And immediately afterwards, they began preaching the gospel. You go, the critics admit that? Because I'll tell you what the most popular theory was 20 years ago. 20 years ago in the Western world, I'm mostly talking North America, Northern Europe, South Africa to a good extent, and many other places around the world selectively. Australia would be like this. New Zealand would be like this. But in the Western world, as I said, they've got their methods of research. I just defined those. But they used to say this. Two of the most prominent scholars in the world, I've heard them say personally to me over a meal, a private meal, both of them said to me, I used to take by the way, I tell you who they are, Richard Bauckham and James D.G. Dunn, who unfortunately just passed away about, maybe about a year ago, from Durham, University of Durham. And Bauckham from, he taught in Scotland for years, and then he retired in the Cambridge area and as a researcher at a college there. And they took this view. It was very common. Raymond Brown, an American, he's probably the American equivalent of Bauckham and Dunn, who are Brits. But Raymond Brown passed away in the 90s, but he was a very prominent American critical New Testament scholar. And Raymond Brown said this, if Jesus had returned in 100 AD and read the Gospel of John, he would have said, that's where I was going. In other words, the idea is John is the gospel that emphasizes deity the most, and it basically took 60-ish years to unpack the heavy things that Jesus was teaching. And Matthew does it, Luke does it, Mark's the earliest, believed by almost everybody, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. But John says the most about deity. Well, according to Raymond Brown, Jesus would have said, John got it right. It just took the church 60 years to unpack what I was saying, like I am passages and before Abraham was. Okay. That's not the most sophisticated view today, but I think Raymond Brown is correct that most people think that it took about 60 years for Christology to, Jesus taught it, don't get me wrong, Jesus taught it, but it took a long time to develop and sink in because you just don't get that heavy stuff. And then all of a sudden he's crucified, and people forget things. They get scared. They go into hiding, we hear in the New Testament. And it takes a while for this stuff to come back out. Well, Bauckham and Dunn changed their views. And here's the new view. I'm going to tell you a sentence, if you haven't heard this before, and you're into theology. It's shocking. It'll grab you. And it's very useful in your apologetics. And Bauckham repeats it, but Bauckham wasn't the first one to do it. The sentence is, the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology. So let me say that this way. Coming out of the gates in 30 AD, there were a lot of these little tiny creeds, which I want to define for you in a moment. But the earliest Christian preaching had Jesus already, ready for this? Already pre-existent Pre-existent, a man. A man pre-existent? How long take you to figure that one out? Like immediately. How about Son of God? Yep. Lord? Yep. One German scholar, Oscar Coleman, years ago, said Lord might be the loftiest of all the names for Jesus, even loftier than when he's called God in the New Testament. Because Lord in the Old Testament is the equivalent, when it gets translated into New Testament, it's the equivalent of Jehovah. Wow. The earliest Christology, the highest Christology. So in the traditional argument is Jesus shared his Father's nature, but I hate using this word because used another way it's a heresy, but I don't know a better word. Orthodox theology says Jesus shared God's nature but was subordinate in position. Now understand, if you say Jesus is subordinate in deity, in other words, he's a little God, that's heresy. That's heresy. He's subordinate in position only. That means he was Jesus says it over and over again. John is the book that says the most times Jesus is God. But think about this. It's also the book that says the most times, I can do nothing but what I see my Father do. I can do nothing. I'm the obedient son. I do what my Father tells me. Wow, that sounds like it's subordinate. Well, yeah, but in position only. Let me give you an example. In the Army, if a general tells a newcomer, go clean the bathroom, go carry these sacks of sand down to the river's edge, the newcomer, the private, does it because the general told him to. He's taking orders, but he's no less of a person than the general is. As a human being and his worth in God's eyes, the private is as much of a person as the general is. Here's another example. Let's say the general says, go carry these sandbags down to the river, and the private says, yes, sir. But that night, they're on the bowling team for their, let's say, school they go to. In this country, it'd be Air Force, Army, Marines, Navy SEALs, whatever. That night you go for your bowling team, and the private is the captain. And when the general bowls the ball in a poor manner or hits the ball in a baseball game, the private says, I've told you before, when you want to get the 10 pin, take a step 2 boards to your left or right. And the general might say, yes, sir, to the private. You see what's happened? Roles change, but they're both equally humans. And that's where the pro-life thing comes from too, concerning fetuses. But back to what this means. Jesus was the obedient son. His father was boss, if you want to say it that way, but that doesn't, boss in terms of taking orders, but it doesn't compromise Jesus' person, his identity. And that's back to Bauckham. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology, and Bauckham calls it the theology of identity. That's personhood, not you're the captain of the bowling team or the baseball team. All right, so deity is very, very important. Now, here's the problem, though. This message was preached immediately. Really? Critics admit that? Well, let me tell you one. He just passed away, unfortunately. Gerrit Ludemann, the very well-known atheist New Testament, the German New Testament scholar, wrote a lot of books. He wrote 2 books against the resurrection. He wrote more than 2 against the resurrection. Did not believe in the resurrection. Like I said, an atheist. But he said the preaching started immediately after the cross. Well, according to the book of Acts, it only took 50 days, right? Pentecost. It took 50 days for Peter's famous sermon. Well, Ludemann, he's not going to die for Peter's sermon on Pentecost, but he is going to tell you that the earliest message began right away. Bart Ehrman's going to tell you Jesus was pre-existent during this time. That means he was believed to be pre-existent. Bart Ehrman, North American atheist, New Testament scholar. He doesn't think Jesus was pre-existent, but he said the early Christians did. Now, why is that? This is the creeds topic, and this is the problem. When they went out preaching the gospel, many of Jesus' hearers were illiterate. In fact, scholars say anywhere from 70 to 90% of Jesus' followers probably couldn't write their name. I shouldn't say Jesus' followers, Jesus' hearers couldn't sign their name. How do you teach the gospel of at least the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus? How do you preach it when your people can't take notes? Most likely won't remember it because they've not been schooled in schooling. They haven't taken how to study type things. So how do you do it? And here was the answer. First, you preach it. And coming out of the gates, this message was preached. What's called high Christology. High Christology, which is identity with God's nature, though subordinate position, yes, that's rarely stated, but equal in identity of nature, died on the cross, rose from the dead. But the people go, that's fine, but they walk away and they don't remember it. They don't know how to take notes. They can explain it to somebody. And this is heavy stuff. It'll almost always get explained wrong to people. So they probably, early Christians probably no doubt made some people heretics. They probably said, yeah, Jesus wasn't quite God, but he was getting there. Or something like that. That's heresy. So what they did was they started preaching in little ditties, little quotations, little things that you can remember, even if you can't write your name. These are called creeds. Now, they're not full-blown creeds like Chalcedon or Nicaea, but they are little memorized snippets. There's dozens of them in the New Testament, and the critics know where they are. Go, well, that sounds kind of subjective. No, you got to be a really good Greek scholar, because there's a lot of ways to tell where these creeds are. It's like, think of a paper. You're writing a graduate paper for your professor, and you're quoting a bunch of people. And when you quote the statement, you might even put it in a block quote, and you say, this isn't mine, it's Tom Wright's. And what do? If you don't say it's Tom Wright's down in a footnote, your prof writes in the margin, according to my book, it's in this volume by Tom Wright. Don't you think you ought to tell us this isn't you? That's telling, fairly where the quote comes from. Well, these quotes come from the apostles, and they spread them around, and there's dozens. But quotations often break the flow of the text. You ever put a quotation into an essay, and it doesn't follow the tense, and you try to make it to fit? It doesn't quite fit, and the professor writes in the margin of your paper, rough transition. You've probably seen that. We all have. Rough transition. Make it a little bit more smooth when you go into a quote by somebody. Take a little care to make your sentence blend in with theirs, but then put the quotation marks there and tell us where you got it. Okay, that's what creeds are in the New Testament. Now, in America, we have a lot of examples of these little ditties. We have secular examples. We have religious examples. Here's a couple popular secular ditties to get a child who can't read or write to say these little things, which might be a step, a preschool step in learning. Here's a couple. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Boy, that's a horrible philosophy. Life is but a dream. But anyway, you get the point. Row, row, row your boat. Here's another one. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Okay, those are two little ditties that many, 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 many school children in our country learn. They're not special. They're not theological, but you've taught them. You've taught them to memorize. You've taught them to recall. That's how you start learning. All right, now here's a religious one. Which one should I use? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now was found, was blind, but now I see. Can I sing that song and not write my name? Yeah, I can quote a hymn. I can quote a little secular ditty. That's what the disciples were trying to get across by doing these little creeds. Romans 10:9 is a creed. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. And in the Greek, it's going to have a cadence to it. Dot, da, dot, da, dot, da, da, dot, da, dot, da, dot, da, dot. The best example in the New Testament is 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, which is Paul saying, I preach to you Corinthians, first two verses, I preach to you Corinthians the gospel. And if you said I do to Jesus, he uses the word believe. If you, the Greek, if you committed your life to Jesus, if you said yes, if you said I do, you're saved, he says. And if not, you're not. He says that in 1 Corinthians 15:1 and 2. And starting in verse 3, he says, watch his words. I gave you what I was given. And here comes the quote. That's his lead in. And here's the quote. How Christ died according to the scriptures. Christ died, was buried, rose again according to the scriptures, and appeared. Twice it says according to the scriptures, and appeared. And then comes this earliest list of appearances to Peter. There's 2 to individuals and 3 to groups. The groups are the 12, all the apostles, and 500 at once. And it says 500 brethren. It's possible that means 500 men. And like the feeding of the 5,000, they didn't call out women and children. There could have been 1,000 people there in that appearance. Could have been. That's the most famous creed in the New Testament. Now, these creeds are very early. They're preached coming out of the gate. High Christology, death with its 20 evidences, medical and otherwise, in that medical article I was telling you about. Resurrection. Josh, if you're interested, if you want to send me an email, if I haven't sent you it already, I can attach that medical article for you, the medical journal, with what medical doctors are saying death by crucifixion is. And I can attach another one, too. We've recently published 2 on the subject. But now let me tell you why this is significant on the resurrection, our third topic. We're talking deity, death, resurrection. It was taught from the earliest time. Jesus was believed to be pre-existent, the Son of God, and even Lord. Out of the gate, he's called Lord. 30, 31, 32 AD, not 95 AD when John was written. Sure, when John was written, but they've been doing it already for 60 years. And that's the emphasis of Richard Bauckham, Larry Hurtado, people like that. They're called the High Christology Club because they're bringing High Christology to the beginning. Garrett Ludeman, as I said, to repeat, said the earliest preaching came on the resurrection came immediately. Bart Ehrman, the North American atheist New Testament scholar, says many of these creeds date just 1 to 2 years after the cross. Now, if it's true that these folks started teaching it right away, and we have what they preach because of the creeds, then get this further fact. About 80% of the creedal statements mostly they're in the epistles, but about 80% of the comments, guess what the topic is? Deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. The earliest topic of the creeds is the innermost circle of the fundamentals. Without it, you have nothing. Without it, you don't have Christianity. Mess it up, and you have heresy. Deity, death, resurrection. And it comes out of the gate where they taught that Jesus is pre-existent. You go, well, let's talk evidence for a minute. So Paul's not a Christian out of the gate. He's a persecutor. Bart Ehrman, back to the atheist New Testament scholar. Notice I quote these guys because I figure if they're going to give it to you, you should use it. If they should give it to you, it's probably got good evidence behind it, and it does. Bart Ehrman says that these creeds usually date 1 to 2 years after the cross. They generally originated in Jerusalem. They could have come from the apostles themselves. And when Paul is saved and goes up to Jerusalem, we'll get touch this in a minute, went up to Jerusalem 3 years later to meet Peter and James, Bart Ehrman says he may have gotten all the creeds that he quotes in his epistles. He may have gotten them right there. Now, let me do a little timeline for you. This is very, very important. Let's say the cross is 30 AD. I don't care if it's 33 AD. All it does is back everything up 3 years. It actually puts it closer to the New Testament book, so it's actually more evidential. But let's say the cross is 30 AD. All right, what's the next line over? That's Garrett Ludeman and others saying immediately high Christology and the gospel data, deity, death, and resurrection is being taught. So the cross, immediate preaching of the gospel. Now, where's Paul at this time? Taking people captive, maybe killing them, sitting there when Stephen's stoned. Paul himself said, I captured these people, took them to court, and I testified against them when it came to their death. When it came to a death sentence, I testified against them. Paul doesn't really ever say he killed people, but he did say he testified against those, and that helped send them to their death. Paul probably knew these early creeds. He comes to Christ. Everybody dates the conversion of Paul at 2 to 3 years after the cross. So if the cross is 30, Paul's conversion is 32 to 33. That gives him 2 to 3 years to hear these creeds that he thought were horrible, stupid, heresy, disobeying the Old Testament. Don't forget, Paul said he was a Pharisee. Paul hated this message. Probably, I picture nothing making Paul angrier than these early creeds because they encapsulated the earliest Christian message of deity, death, resurrection. And Paul saw to it that people went to jail or worse for this. But then on the way to Damascus, in +2 or +3, he meets the risen Jesus. In Galatians 1, footnote, critics will accept 7 of the books that have Paul's name on them. Of the 7, I'll give you the sources here real fast, but they'll let you quote these books. They don't think they're inspired, but they think that Paul was a scholar. He was a Pharisee. He's a scholar. Just read his stuff. He's very intelligent. He knows how to put an argument together. And he wouldn't lie. He might be wrong. This is the critic's view. Paul might be wrong, but he wouldn't lie purposely. So when Paul talks, you can believe that that's what they believed. And the 7 books they'll give you, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Let me give you those again. The first 4 of the Pauline books, according to the canon, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, that's 4. Philippians, that's 5. 1 Thessalonians, that's 6. Philemon, that's 7. And they'll let you quote this. And so Paul's hearing these creeds. He mixes the creeds in his epistles. You can find many of them there. And Romans 10:9 may be my favorite, as I've already told you, because of the word Lord being used, and it's Jehovah in the Old Testament, as Paul tells you. The whole thing is there. So he goes up to Jerusalem a mere 3 years later. So if he's converted at 32 to 33, he's in Jerusalem at 35 to 36. Folks, if you ever do ancient history, that's a field I'm trained in philosophy, but I do most of my work in ancient history. You don't find this in ancient history. You especially don't find it in religious history. If you've never heard this before, and you can adapt it to your own ministry, but Alexander the Great, secular example. Earliest biography of Alexander the Great. There are earlier ones, but we don't have them. We may find them someday. We don't have them now. Earliest biography of Alexander the Great, almost 300 years later, 280. The best biographies of Alexander are 425 to 450 years later, almost half a millennium to write about the greatest military general, it said, who lived up until that time, about 300 BC. And those two sources are Arrian and Plutarch. Arrian and Plutarch, writing almost a half a millennium. You go, well, you're just picking a bad example. Actually, it's not a bad example at all. Some of the Caesars, Suetonius' 12 Caesars, written about 120 AD. He talks about Julius and Caesar Augustus. Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, first two. And his source is more than 100 years after. That's really good in the ancient world. 100 years is really good. When Bart Ehrman does his history of the early church, he lets you use sources up to 100 years later. So he lets you use sources from 30 AD to 130 AD. That goes beyond the canon. And then you have to take the separate, to play this game, you got to take the separate verses out that you want to use and evidence those verses. That's how critics argue. Okay, so back to Paul. He's in Jerusalem at 35 or 36. That's 5 to 6 years after the cross. He meets with Peter and James for 15 days in Galatians 1. Let me remind you the theme of the book of Galatians. It's real simple. Paul says, here's the theme, it's all about the gospel. Make it too big, it's heresy. Make it too small, it's heresy. Keep it on the deity, death, resurrection of Christ, right about there, that's fine. It's all about the preaching of the gospel. And in that context, he goes to Jerusalem at +5 or +6, talks to Peter and James for 15 days. Here, if I were Paul, here's what I would most want to have asked Peter and James. Hey, y'all hear that I came to Christ on the way to Damascus? I'll tell you what Jesus looked like to me if you'll tell me about your experience. I want to know what the risen Jesus looked like to you. And Peter, not trying to put you down, man, but you denied the Lord 3 times. James, not trying to put you down, but you didn't believe in your brother before the crucifixion. Me? I'm the worst of all. I was a persecutor. I don't even deserve to be an apostle. Which, by the way, if you're preaching a sermon, there's a footnote for you. God redeems the lives of people who have been messed up. That's a good theme. And those 3 right there, they had been messed up at one time. And anyway, so I imagine Paul saying, you tell me what Jesus looked like when you saw him on Sunday. I don't want to put you guys down, but if you remember correctly, you guys were hiding because you were scared of the Romans. That's what I read from your sources. And I went after people, but God got a hold of us. That's what I want to know. Well, in Galatians 2, he goes back to Jerusalem again 14 years later. And guess who's there? Paul's there. Peter's still there. James, the brother of Jesus, is still there. And John is there. What's significant about these? They're the big 4. Nobody in church history are more influential than those 4. Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. 2 of the 12, and 2 more, Paul and James, who are called apostles. They're there. And in 35 to 36 AD, what's their topic? This will bring this whole thing around, coming to our conclusion. The topic is Galatians 2:2. Paul said, I set before them the gospel I was preaching to see if I was running or had run in vain. Go, what? Yeah, I gave them the gospel I was preaching to the Gentiles just to make sure we're all on the same page. Well, bless you, Paul. We didn't have very many researchers in the early church, but Paul's a trained Pharisee, and he's doing his research. What's he doing? He's interviewing the eyewitnesses. He's interviewing the eyewitnesses. Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. They saw the risen Jesus right after the cross. Paul had to wait a few years. As he says, 1 Corinthians 15:8, last of all, he appeared to me as one born out of due time. By the way, that Greek word for born out of due time is the Greek word for aborted or miscarried. Paul says, I was aborted or miscarried. You guys were there at the beginning. I missed the boat for a few years. So he goes to those guys. And, okay, well, did the big three, Paul calls them the pillars of the church, did the pillars agree with him on his gospel? What's the gospel? Well, let Paul say it. Romans 10:9. That's not Paul, you remember. He's quoting their creed, right? That would be a footnote. Peter would be in the footnote or something like that. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. In the order there, it's deity, resurrection, death, but they're all there. He says, you know what I believe? What do you all believe? Well, right after Paul gave him his gospel, you find these 5 words in English. They added nothing to me. They added nothing to me. What's that mean? We're all on the same page. A few verses later, Galatians 2:9, they lay hands on Paul and Barnabas and send them out to missions work. Look at you folks. They laid hands on them and sent them out to missions work. Now, I don't know, Josh, you guys, I don't know, the churches you go to, you ever lay your hands on heretics? I mean, do you lay your hands on known heretics? I don't think that's the way the church operates. So when the Gospels lay hands on Paul and Barnabas in Galatians 2:9, accepted by critics, this passage is accepted by critics. What were they doing? They're saying, you're our brother. You take, as they specifically say, you take it to the Gentiles, we'll take it to the Jews. But the gospel message is the same. Why is this important? Because I've just given you 5 steps in between 30 AD and 36 AD, just 6 years max. These 5 steps of historical evidence have occurred. Number 1, the preaching started immediately. By the way, there's a Greek word for that. It's a New Testament word. It's called homologia. Homologia means the original message that everybody agreed to. Homologia means the heart of something. In chemistry, it's a different message, right? The homologia is a different message in the field of chemistry. I don't know what it would be. And it's something else in physics. And it's something else in journalism. But for Christians, the homologia, one of the guys who write the most on this says, the homologia centered on the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Yes, other things are mentioned. Jesus was born of a woman. Well, that's important because I guess we're talking about the incarnation there. But deity, death, resurrection, always there. Okay, that's step 1. Out of the gate, Garrett Ludeman preached immediately. Step 2, James, in that very early stage, James becomes a believer. How do we know this? Because James and his brothers didn't agree. And this is a difficult question, but it actually says in the book of Mark that his countrymen, when he went back home to preach Jesus, they thought he was out of his mind. The Greek word is he was in 2 minds. He was mentally ill. And it seems from the passage in Mark 3 and Mark 6 that Jesus' family agreed. That's rough. And so James comes from that background, but he's converted. That's the second step. First one is homologia. They preached it. How do you know James was there real early? This is interesting. In Acts chapter 1, Jesus ascends just before the first sermon, just before the immediately. And James and Mary, it says Mary and the brothers were up in what we call the upper room. They were in prayer with the other apostles. They were all together meeting with the church. First time we read that in the Gospels. All the references to Jesus' brothers in the Gospels are all negative. In fact, John 7:5 specifically said his brothers did not believe. But he's there with the early Christians. The sermon starts right away. Second step, James sees Jesus and is totally transformed. That's the second of the levels here. Third, You got those pre-Pauline creeds. Folks, I may not have made this plain, but a number of the earliest creeds were around before Paul was converted, right? I told you Paul probably hated them, knew them, row, row, row your boat. Our hymns that we sing, those are creeds. So number one, they preach it immediately. Number two, James comes to the Lord. Number three, the pre-Pauline, critics call them the pre-Pauline creeds. 4, Paul's conversion, just 2 to 3 years later, Paul's conversion, and his first trip to Jerusalem. He makes a second trip, but that one's years later. I'm trying to argue that these 5 things were present by 36 AD. These 5 things are present by 36 AD. Once again, homologia, immediate preaching of the gospel. 2, James, conversion. 3, the development of pre-Pauline creeds. 4, Paul's conversion. 5, Paul goes to Jerusalem. And let me tell you guys something that might be kind of shocking. I think we'd have to argue about this, but Paul's number one contribution to Christianity could be his being the greatest missionary ever. Could be his being the greatest theologian ever. But I tend to think, and it kind of falls in with all these, Paul's greatest contribution to Christianity might be those 2 trips to Jerusalem to meet Peter and James, and later Peter, James, and John, because he got their agreement that they were all preaching the same thing on the inner kernel of the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And by the way, if you want a verse to back this up, besides the ones I already gave you, they added nothing to me, and they gave him the right hand of fellowship. In 1 Corinthians 15:11, right after Paul gives the creed, he says, whether it is I, the apostles, he just got done talking about them, whether it's I or they, so we preach and so you believe. Paul's saying, I don't care if you get this message from me. If you don't get it from me, go talk to Peter. Go talk to James. Go talk to John. Believe me, you're going to hear the same thing. We worked this out. 1 Corinthians 15:11, great verse that critics accept because they accept 1 Corinthians, because they like Paul. So 5 steps. There's nothing like it in ancient history to have this much data, especially religious history. Okay, I told you about Alexander. How about the other folks? Well, Zoroaster in the Middle East, earliest theological publications, ready? 1,000 years after he died. Buddha. I've got a book on my shelf. I'm in my study here. I got a book on my shelf right over here on the left. It's called The Buddhist Scriptures, written by a PhD Buddhist. And he starts on, it's not page 1, but the first book page you open it to, it says this. I'm paraphrasing, juicing it up a little bit. He says, hey, to you Christians, we don't have what you have. You have the words of your Lord. We don't have the words of our Lord, Buddha. You have the words of those who studied under your Lord, Paul, and so on. We don't have the words of those who studied under the Lord. In fact, you have the words of those who studied under your Lord. We don't have those either. And then the next line is quite shaking. He says, the selections I've chosen in this book for the most precious Buddhist scriptures are generally 600 to 800 years after Buddha died. 600 to 800 years later. And they're going to complain about us using 5 sources by 6 years? 5 sources within 6 years? Folks, that's how you do history. With history, you want the 2 big E's. Early eyewitnesses. Now listen, eyewitnesses can be wrong. Critics tell me this all the time. Atheists write to me all the time. Hey, dude, you think you can get back to the early eyewitnesses? Did you ever hear something? Eyewitnesses can lie. Yes, they can. They can be wrong. But here's my answer to them. What do you want me to do? Use very late non-eyewitnesses? Would that make you feel better? How about very late non-eyewitnesses? Would that float your boat? No, you're going to want early eyewitnesses for whatever you're doing. That's how you do history, and we have it. And we have many other rules for history that are fulfilled. Right here. Let me end. According to my clock, I'm at 61 minutes, 1 minute over an hour. Let me end with a quotation from a Australian Christian historian. His name is Paul Barnett. You can get here's one of his books right here. I just happen to have it next to me. He's got a trilogy on the historical Jesus. And this is called The Birth of Christianity, the first 20 years. This is really cool because he doesn't do what most Christians do. He didn't say the birth of Christianity and go up to Martin Luther, or the birth of Christianity and tell you what they were doing the first missions 200 years later. He doesn't even talk about Chalcedon and Nicaea at 325 to 451 AD. He does the first 20 years. Now, critics admit my data. It's all over the place. But he's going to tell you how you can construct a history of Christianity from the earliest sources we get the gospel. And you know what he says in here? He's an historian. Here's what he says. No prominent person in history has the early eyewitness data that we have for Jesus. Did you hear that? Nobody in ancient history, east, west, north, south, great founders of empires, great military geniuses, great historians, great philosophers, nobody has the kind of data that we do for Jesus. Are you kidding me? Five historical sources within 6 maximum years, and it could have been 5 years. He could have been, remember, he was converted at 2 to 3. If he's converted at 2, then he's in Jerusalem at 35. That's 5 years later. And they admit that Paul got this data early. They don't believe it because we're more influenced by our worldview than we are by facts. That's everybody. Everybody in the world is more influenced by your family, what you've already believed, your culture, and they maybe don't know why they disagree with you, but they disagree with you. They may not be able to emphasize it. They can't cite Buddha. They can't cite Zoroaster. They can't cite, by the way, you ready for the big one? The Bhagavad Gita of Hinduism. Maybe the best known source. The Upanishads, that's another one. The Upanishads for the Hindu. Earliest source we have? 1,800 years later. 1,800 years later. Yeah, but here's the biggie. What about the Bhagavad Gita, often called the Gita? What about the Bhagavad Gita? The earliest source we have, if Krishna lived in history. And I'm citing Hindu scholars when they say, I got a Hindu scholar who says the majority of Hindu scholars don't believe he lived in history. But that's when he was supposed to have lived. The earliest copy of the Bhagavad Gita, I'm told, is 4,200 years later. The Upanishads, 1,800. Zoroaster, 1,000. Was I picking a bad source in Buddha? Not at all. He's only 600 to 800 years later. Jesus, 5 arguments within 5 to 6 years. By the eyewitnesses. We have a fantastic basis. There's no one like this. And you wonder why people around the world can't stand us. Because our baseball team hits more home runs, more hits, has better pitchers, and they don't like teams that win all the time. You know, that's why the New York Yankees aren't very popular some places. I'm not trying to be triumphant. I'm just saying God has given us a very special message. And by the way, one comment, and I'll end here, see if you have any questions. When I was talking to Josh just a few weeks ago at ETS in Dallas, we had a great time together. How long, Josh? 3 hours?
Yeah, we spent 3 hours together.
3 hours. And I asked Josh a question. Josh, what do you say if a skeptic says to you, you got a bunch of early Christian stories, but all those early Christian stories are phone tag. You guys know about the phone tag thing, right? You've put 5 people in a row. You tell a secret to the first one. They tell a second one. They tell a third one. They do this on talk shows. And by the time the 5th person gets the story and they tell it, everybody laughs because it's not the story that the first one told. It's already changed. Be careful saying Christian truth, the Gospel of John, whatever. Be careful of saying it's too early for mythology. It's not too early for mythology. Here's how long mythology takes. 6 people in phone tag. The 6th person 15 minutes later screws the story up. And it becomes sort of a myth. How do you know this early message? 5 sources in 6 years. How do you know it's not phone tag? Here, first of all, the critics admit it. Now, that doesn't prove it. Please, please, please. People misunderstand me. Because the critics admit it doesn't mean it's true. The question is, why do the critics admit it? Because we have so much data for each one of these. Of these 6 facts that I'm going to use, which are not the same as the 5 I just gave you, but the 6 facts, which, by the way, Christ died by crucifixion. His disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Everybody admits this. 3, they were transformed even to the point of being willing to die. Don't say they all died. It's really hard to prove that. But the big ones, the first 3 in Jerusalem, Paul, Peter, and John, we have first century sources for their martyrdom. First century, one of them Josephus, non-Christian. They were transformed. It was preached very, 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 very early. And then you have 2 converts of 2 biggies, unbelievers, James and Paul. Those are the 6. Cross became Christians because they had experiences they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Their lives were transformed. It was preached very, very early, and you got James and Paul. Everyone concedes those. And Barnett says we have nothing like that in the ancient world. But here's the answer to the phone tag. How do you know it wasn't phone tag? Story keeps getting bigger and bigger. Paul is the hero here. I think the biggest thing Paul does for us is that he went to Jerusalem and talked to the eyewitnesses. How do you know it's not phone tag? Because Paul went to the eyewitnesses and did the research that he tells about Galatians 1 and again in Galatians 2. And then in 1 Corinthians 15:11, he said, they're preaching the same thing I am about the appearances. Paul is the line that ties it all together because he got the research that says, I didn't ask Zoroaster what Christians believe. I didn't ask Buddha what Christians believed. I went to Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, not the son of Zebedee, James and John. I went to them. I got the story from those who saw him and who are willing to die. And at least Paul, Peter, and James, we have testimonies of their martyrdom. They went all the way to their death, which tells you they believe the message. All right, I'll stop right there. Nothing like it in the ancient world. You can take the message with you, and it's the strongest. Get this. What if God made the strongest arguments for Christianity that Moses crossed the Red Sea? 52 evidences Moses crossed the Red Sea, and all the critics will grant that. That's kind of like the Old Testament gospel. They always refer to that as salvation. That's physical salvation for them, crossing the water. But God didn't tell you in the New Testament all the evidence we have came, let's pick something. All the evidence in the New Testament came from the fact that some early Christians preached a message. That's where all the evidence is. But we don't know it's not phone tag. God gave us the greatest evidence at the most important junctions. Deity, death, resurrection, we call the gospel, the fundamental of the fundamentals. God gave us the most important evidence at the most important place, and that's why it's not phone tag. Okay, I'm done. Josh, do we have questions or?
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Habermas. It was outstanding. Comments, lots of guys were ladies who were commenting on the side. Let's open it up for questions. Ryan, did you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, if you have a question, it would be great for you to throw it in the chat. I saw one earlier. Godfried asked a question. Was Paul in Jerusalem when Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead, but did not meet Jesus personally?
We have no reason to believe that Paul was in Jerusalem when Jesus died on the cross. He very, very well may have been, but we have to leave it there. We don't have any data that he was in Jerusalem at that time. He never says, seemed to me in some of his arguments, it would have been very convenient to say, and I saw the man in the flesh, I watched him die. That would be very convenient if you're going to talk about the starting with the deity and then the death of Jesus. So I would suspect he never saw him physically. And probably the closest he came was shortly before Stephen was stoned. And he saw how what you have there is he's holding the coats of the people who stoned Stephen. What you have there is an early Christian martyr, not a disciple, but you have an early Christian disciple, and you have an angry young man who sat there and was really ticked at what these guys are preaching because he's a Pharisee and quite straightforwardly, he believed what Christians were preaching contradicted the Old Testament, the Word of God. And he did what turned Paul upside down on the way to Damascus You say, why did the Christians come out of the gate like gangbusters right after the cross and resurrection? You know why? Because of the resurrection. The resurrection, here's the reasoning. You can do it real fast. You can make the argument in 1 minute. Whoa, this guy taught a lot of heavy stuff. He even said he was the Son of God. I mean, who does that? I wanted to believe him. I mean, I did. I followed him for a few years. Just didn't know what to think. But I ran and hid when he died. I wasn't all the way there yet, you know. But then when the resurrection happened, it all came together. Because here's what the resurrection says to me. And you find this in the New Testament several times. Here's what the resurrection says to me. Dead men don't rise. In fact, dead men don't do much. So if he rose from the dead, God had to have worked on him. If God worked on him, then God had to approve him. Why? Because God doesn't raise heretics from the dead. Secondly, he's the only person in human history. You know, you folks know this. Probably, I'm sure you know it better than I do. The Orthodox religions in the world, nobody, at least not the main branch of them. There may be some small group somewhere, but the main people in the world, religions, do not teach that their founder was raised from the dead. It's not there. In fact, I have a journal article that I published with Cambridge University Group that you can get off my website. A lot of stuff on my website, GaryHabermas.com, or my YouTube channel. There's over 100, anything from 3-minute to 2-hour lectures. And it usually majors on this stuff, usually deity, death, resurrection. You can go back and look at those things, and you can get some of this historical data and sources and things like that. But nobody else teaches he was raised from the dead. And just a moment, I said 1 minute, just a moment's reflection, he died. He was dead as a doornail. And then I saw him alive. I touched him. What's my problem? I touched a dead man. No, I touched a live man who was dead. What does that mean? He can't raise himself. The Father raised him. If the Father raised him, the Father doesn't raise heretics. The Father raises, saviors, prophets. Of course, there are no other examples. So Jesus must have been who he said he was. Otherwise, he's a heretic. And if Jesus was who he said he was, because proven by his Father raising him from the dead, hey, I better get on board. And besides, let me give you a shorter, direct argument. If you see the resurrected Jesus, you are looking at heaven. Think about this. An appearance of the risen Jesus is an appearance of what I like to call walking, talking, eternal life. Because Jesus would never die again. They were seeing heaven on earth. For 40 days, the light of heaven shone down on the Middle East, and Jesus walked around. Heaven visited earth. There's a Christian song we sing, at least years ago. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. For 40 days, heaven came down, and they saw walking, talking heaven. That's how they made the argument. 1 minute version. He died. He can't do anything. Dead men don't do anything. If anybody raised him, the Father has to. He's the creator. He's the only one who can raise. But he wouldn't raise a heretic, so he raised somebody who spoke the truth. Now I got to know what Jesus taught because it's true. And the center of Jesus' teaching, by the way, is the kingdom of God and how to get there. It's almost unanimous with skeptics. We say it popularly in gospel songs. We say, he holds the keys. He holds the keys to the kingdom. The kingdom is coming. You better get on board. That's his number one message. So direct argument. If Jesus was raised from the dead, the trip to heaven is historical. The gospel is historical because God otherwise raises a heretic. That's it.
Hallelujah. Ibn Sarkar asks, how do the critical scholars distinguish creeds from normal text? He says, I know one way is checking out the Greek text. You got to be really, really good in the Greek. There are as many as about 10 rules they use to pick these creeds out. Now, I have a Greek minor. A Greek minor is no good. I mean, I had 16 hours of Greek. That just makes me dangerous. You've got to ask these guys like Richard Bauckham, Jimmy Dunn, again, passed away. Larry Hurtado, unfortunately, passed away. Just recently. But these guys who are really good Greek scholars, the
the creeds break the syntax. They break the flow of what the epistle. And that's just one. Sometimes we're told it's a creed. I mean, twice. 1 Corinthians 11, the communion passage. 1 Corinthians 15, the gospel passage. Both times, Paul says this: I gave you what I was given. What's he saying? This isn't mine. It was in existence before me. So sometimes they tell you, the epistles say over and over again, observe the traditions of the elders. The traditions is a synonym for creeds. Sometimes they're just called traditions. They go by different names. Creeds, traditions, confessions. And also, Josh, they're preceded by words like this: we confess, ... we believe, ... That's another thing that introduces creeds. Again, they're going for the most important thing. So they're not going to say to you, yeah, I'm a dispensationalist and I think this is okay, whatever. Let's not argue about eschatology. That's not where the creeds break in. The creeds almost always break in, not on things Christians disagree on, but on things Christians agree on. And they always break in on the deity, death, resurrection. It's almost 80% of the creeds are those topics over and over and over. I'll give you other ones if you want. Romans 1, 3, and 4. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians 11. I gave you that which I also received from the Lord. How the same night which he was betrayed, he took bread, he broke it, gave thanks, saying, this is my body which is broken for you. Whoop, time out. This is my body which is broken. Gospel, death of Christ. And he doesn't mention resurrection there, but he does say, when you drink this, you drink it in me. You think about this until he returns. The second coming implies a resurrection. Jesus has to be alive to return. So, anyway,
Philippians 2, 5 through 11, Colossians 1, Hebrews 1.
Yeah,
they're all
long. Yeah, you're mentioning some biggies. Philippians 2 is huge because there's an example of an early Christian creed where Jesus is pre-existent. That's why Bart Ehrman says it's there from the beginning. By the way,
and Gathercole covers pre-existence in the "I have come" statements in his pre-existence son book.
Yes, he's got that.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So there's also you can't just say that the early epistles and it was just a creation of Paul. There is the synoptics are saying it as well.
Yeah, the best one of the synoptics is Luke 24:34. That when the men from Emmaus go to see the apostles, they say the disciples say, he is risen indeed and appeared to Peter. That comment in Luke 24:34 is believed by critics to be an early creed. And there's an incredible, let me see if I can find it here real quickly. I don't cite this one as much. Somebody help me. Where does Paul take Jesus and move him into the Shema? Josh,
1 Corinthians 8:6.
That's it. First, I'm sitting right there, and I'm just not looking at the verse. 1 Corinthians 8:6, which remember, critics are going to grant. This is by Paul. Here's the verse. Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ. Here's the discussion today. It's easy to miss this. Paul didn't. The Creed has moved Jesus into the Shema. The Shema is the John 3:16 of the Old Testament, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Now, notice something about that verse. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. There's Lord in that verse and God in that verse. Paul makes God, the Creed, makes God the Father and Jesus the Lord. If you ever notice that in 8:6 there is a verse. You talk about how Christology.
Yep.
High Christology, they moved him into the Shema. What are you doing? Are you crazy? No, I'm being biblical.
Thomas has his hand raised. Thomas, would you like to ask a question?
Can you unmute yourself? Ryan, do you have to unmute him?
Oh, let's see here.
I have a question that Ryan and I want to ask, but I'll wait after Thomas.
You're going to blame it on Ryan?
Okay, go ahead, Thomas. You should be able to unmute now. You're still muted.
Hi, Thomas. Yeah, it's not working. Your headphones.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have a problem with the mic. First of all, thank you so much for Dr. Gary for such a great lecture. And it was so smooth. This is the most thing I like about it. It was so smooth.
This is a Nabil, Gary.
This is what?
This is a Nabil.
A Nabil. Thomas, you're a Nabil, huh?
Who knows? God is good. But God showed his grace to my humbleness. And he is amazing. God is amazing. And I want to thank you. That's before all. I want to thank you for this great lecture. And to take this also to how much it is related to us. You talked a lot about Paul. And as you know, that the main theme of Muslim apologists, when we talk about Paul as a witness, that they complain that actually Paul created Christianity. And they want to turn over the idea against us and to say that Paul cannot be a witness because it was his way to get accepted. And regardless, a lot of stupid verses, the way they interpret verses from the Bible, like Paul saying, I'm an ignorant, let me be a liar, regardless these parts. I just want to say that it became so popular in the Muslim world when we mention Paul as one of the strongest evidences for conversion, that someone met the Lord and changed everything. And he was preaching to the whole world. And my question to you is, what would you answer a Muslim who is telling you that? If you are now talking to a Muslim and telling you, you know what, no, this is something that Paul has made up, and that's why it's the earliest evidence, and that's why it's the first thing that has been written is what Paul has written, and that's all made up. And all of them after that followed him. What's the most thing you would focus with?
Well, I wish I had about 3 hours because I am doing.
We can do this again, Ryan.
I am doing a magnum opus on the resurrection of Jesus right now. And it is thousands of pages long. And it's going to have all this kind of
5,500 pages long.
It's going to have a lot of this evidence by God's grace. And by the way, Thomas, thank you for your compliment. But on my research, this isn't my stuff. I like to tell people, God did it. I just talk about it, right? That's what all of us do. God did it. We talk about it. But in this big thing that Josh just mentioned to you, this big study, I've got 150 pages answering that question. And here's a couple of the issues, but I'll save the best one for last, but I'll make it brief. Most scholars today, see, what they're going to teach, what I think you're going to probably say is, Paul borrowed this stuff from Hellenistic sources. He got it from Greek sources. So he's bringing heresy into the Christian church. And basically, the gospel is Paul's. And since Paul is a Hellenist, the gospel is Hellenistic philosophy. He stole it from Jupiter and Hercules and Isis and Osiris. And if you're going to, the smarter ones, the better ones among them, they're going to go back and try to tell you how you get this in mythology. Okay. You ready for this? Virtually no accredited scholar who's in the field. See, whenever they quote people, Jesus never lived. Paul was the founder of Christianity. Those kind of radical theses, they're largely made by people. I don't want to put down people who haven't been to school, but most of us can't get all this by studying on our own. We have to have somebody help us with it, right? The New Testament even says, turn this over to faithful persons who will be able to tell other people. We need to learn from people. And they didn't. And they got this on their own. And they read a bunch of fire-breathing people who don't know what they're talking about. You go, well, that's bold of you to say that. Why do you say that? Because the guys I read They're specialist terminal degree New Testament scholars. I don't care. I prefer them to be atheists. That's a horrible thing to say, but I prefer them to be atheists, agnostics, non-Christians by their own lips, and skeptics, because I can use their material. They don't believe this stuff, but they're going to tell you it's true. And Bart Ehrman, here's his book right here where he says it.
I was reading that last night, getting ready for this.
Yep. Did Jesus exist? He's got 20 pages on here, Thomas. He's an atheist. He's got 20 pages on here on how that theory is totally bunk. And he says over and over again, there were no pre-Christian resurrection tales. And he quotes a very famous scholar who just died, unfortunately, one of our top universities, University of Chicago. He's a secular scholar with a PhD from Yale in history of religions. This guy's very well known. His name is Smith. And he's got a famous one-liner, and Ehrman cites it. And it goes like this. In the ancient world, people go away, travel, and come back. Other people die and don't rise. Some people are seen, but they didn't die. But what you don't have in the ancient world, Smith says, is somebody who died and rose. You go, well, no, you don't believe that because you're not that religion. And Smith goes, no, you're not listening. That is not in the ancient world. And a Swedish scholar named Mettinger, wrote a book on this a few years ago. And he believes it is in the ancient world. He's a scholar. And he says he thinks he can find 3 places where it is. Now, it's not close to the New Testament teaching, but it's just anything in that category. But you know what he says? Very valuable. He says, I'm one of 3 scholars in the world who believe this. One of 3. The vast majority of atheists, agnostic, non-Christian, skeptical, specialists think that's a bunch of bunk. Okay, that's a biggie. If you get this book, there's stuff in here. I hope you're good on not having doubts. He can tell you things. Expect Bart Ehrman to say Jesus is not the Son of God. The New Testament's not reliable, but he'll tell you a whole bunch of passages that are reliable where that was taught. So he does a lot of good things. I use it for a textbook with my PhD students. But he specifically gives you all that data. And he quotes these guys. There's no sources for that, according to scholars. And Mettinger, who believes it, says I'm one of 3. And let me tell you one more thing. I was lecturing in Sweden a few years ago, and one of Mettinger's students told me that Mettinger himself is a Christian. So even though Mettinger thinks there are sources that say that, it does not come close to disproving Christianity.
Oh, shoot.
You need to unmute yourself, Doctor. I don't hear you.
How's that? Am I all right? Okay, good. Here's the big one. Thomas, you may already have been assuming this. Does anybody have a guess? I already gave you the refutation of this today without even directing myself to it. What's the biggest refutation of Paul as the founder of Christianity? First of all, my first comment was there was no pre-Paul Christianity, so Paul didn't bring it from Hellenism. But what's the refutation we gave today? This is your biggest comeback right now, probably, because it's the hot one.
I think that one of the biggest things that Jesus' brother came to faith, one of the biggest things, because if someone wants to make things up, it should have been Jesus' brother, not Paul. So,
that's good. That's
okay.
Good. How about another one? It was the minute I say it, you're going to go, oh, of course. I just didn't think about it. But we spent 20 minutes on it today.
Can I try to answer?
Sure. If you want to take a shot, go.
Yeah. So it's like Paul says, I think it's in Galatians, that they added nothing to me. And then the visitation and how he was discussing with James and Peter, and they were all in agreement. I think that.
Exactly. But get this. we have a phrase. I don't know cross-culturally which of you say these phrases and which ones you don't, but we have a phrase in America. He got it from the horse's mouth. he went right back to the source and got it. Paul not only went back to the horse's mouth, he didn't just go back to Peter, but get this. What did we already talk about? The confessions, the creeds, the traditions. Were they pre-Paul or post-Paul?
Pre-Paul.
They're pre-Paul. Okay, you guys get it now? If it's pre-Paul, Paul didn't invent it. It made Paul angry. Paul hated it. He heard the message. Jesus' deity. He died on the cross. He rose from the dead. And Paul says, you are a heretic and you're going to die. Then he met Jesus and he changed his mind. But the point is, that was a central Christian message taught immediately, and Paul wasn't there immediately. Paul didn't get it. Well, he made it bigger as he went on. Really? Then go back to the creeds. Do your dissertation. Do your doctoral dissertation. I've got 3 books over here that are famous books on the creeds. They're critics. These guys are critics. And they will tell you where the creeds are, what they say, and how it's pre-Pauline. And they'll say the dumbest response of all is that Paul invented this stuff. He hated it. Paul hated it. So the creeds are now the number one comeback. They're but see, the only problem is you got to teach people what creeds are. And it's not difficult material, but it's detailed. There's a lot of moving parts. So Paul couldn't have made up the message that he hated and made sure people died who were preaching it. Then later Paul gets it. And Bart Ehrman, this guy right here, what were the creeds? They existed before Paul in Jerusalem, probably from the apostles. Paul got it from them, and he repeated their information. So guess what? Paul was not part of this line of communication. It's not Paul's. There's a big book. If you want to get a hold of it, I'm looking at it over there on the shelf. Let me see if I can read the exact title from over here. Paul, founder of Christianity or follower of Jesus or founder of Christianity. It's published by Erdman's, which is a top-notch critical publisher. And it's a big book. Tom Wright says it's the major answer to this if you want to do a lot of work on it. But once again, Paul, my eyes are getting bad. Paul, follower of Jesus or founder of Christianity, ? And a long time ago, J. Gresham Machen, one of our top Greek scholars from Princeton in the old days here, he wrote a book called The Origin of Paul's Religion. The Origin of Paul's Religion. And he tells you why it didn't, even back then, this book's written like 1914 or 1920. He tells you this is not a Hellenistic argument. Paul didn't get it from it. But that book right there is probably the according to, I think it is too when I read it, but outside a better person, Tom Wright says it's the best book on the subject. But the main thing here is you can get to real quickly. As long as it's going to take you to explain the creeds to them, it's going to take you less time than to tell them about Hellenistic philosophy and why there's no dying and rising gods and why Mettinger is only one of 3. And while the main one, Smith, there's 2 Smiths, Zachary Smith, Mark Smith, they both say there are none, and they're famous for this argument. It takes you longer to develop that argument. But I think the better one hits harder, is that the Greek themes came out before Paul was ever converted. He hated the message. That's why he was persecuting.
Gary, do you have a handout or something that just basically lists the creeds and then has the atheist scholar underneath saying this is, probably around this date, or this is pre-Pauline, or something along those lines? Because I think that would be an amazing resource that just is a creed, the secular author, and the source.
Okay, I'll tell you what. If you'll write and ask me for that, Ryan, if you want the medical journal article that talks about how do we know Jesus died by crucifixion, I can send that to you. I can send you a cognate one, which is the most learned book on crucifixion that was yet published. It's right here. I just reviewed this thing for a journal. You ready for this? This is published in Germany. I'm German. Germans don't mess around when they publish things. Crucifixion in the Mediterranean world. You ready? Over 500 pages on death by crucifixion. Earliest sources, what they teach, why it's nails and not ropes, everything you want. Anyway,
Wow.
I could send you a review of that book. I'll attach that too. Yes, I have a list of the creeds. Now, I don't know if I have it on a sheet of paper. It might be a PowerPoint, but I can send you a PowerPoint that lists the number of the creeds. And I can list, probably the best way I could tell you how we know they're allowed is I can send you a list of the pages of Bart Ehrman, where Bart Ehrman lists a lot of the creeds and where he tells you that many of them date 1 to 2 years after the cross. He says that over and over and over and over. You can't mistake it. He says it 100 times. He says it about a dozen times in this book, that they're 1 to 2 years after the cross, and that you get pre-existence, you get the whole 9 yards. I'll let Bart Ehrman say it. Once again, he's an atheist New Testament scholar. So I'll give you pages of Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, that's great because the Muslims quote him extensively, so we can quote him.
Good.
Right.
Hey, you know what? You know what he says in one of his first books, in a book called Jesus? He says, the resurrection is not what founded Christianity. It was the disciples' belief in the resurrection. Well, that's one of my minimal facts. The disciples had experiences that they believe were appearances of the risen Jesus. And then Bart says this, and you think he was an evangelist on this line. He says, it wasn't the actual appearances. It was their belief that it was the actual appearances. And then he says, this teaching was there at the beginning, and it was so profound, I love his phrase, that from that time on, the disciples' belief in the resurrection turned the world on its ear. It's a great quote. It turned the world on its ear. That's what made them bold witnesses willing to die. It wasn't just that Jesus gave them lofty deal. One time they were studying for the final exam and it just all clicked, because it didn't click. They were in hiding after the crucifixion. What clicked it was the resurrection. And to say it non-colloquially, not even a paraphrase, what they said to each other at that point was, dude, this guy was really Lord. This guy was really the Son of God, or he wouldn't be walking around talking to us. That's an act of God. It was the resurrection, as Bart Ehrman says, that turned the teaching of the resurrection that turned the world on its ear. I love that phrase. Yeah, Ryan, if you'll remind me what you want, I'll attach at least those 4 things: 2 articles on crucifixion, a list of some of the creeds, and pages where you can find them in Bart Ehrman, and you and or Josh or anyone else, you guys who have the book, you can go through there and get the pages and give them the quotations. But Bart Ehrman, again, I've said this several times, says all the following. They originated in Jerusalem, could very well have come from the apostles. They were pre-Pauline. And this one I've only maybe said once. He says all the creeds that Paul quotes, and Paul quotes more than anybody. Well, he's a scholar, He said of all the creeds Paul cited, he may have gotten every one of them when he went to Jerusalem and talked to James and James and Peter. Bingo, right there. They're theirs, not his. He got them from them, possibly from them, but from that ilk. And every one he could have gotten before, it could have been in existence before he was saved. So there's the answer to that Hellenistic comeback. I will, Thomas, back to your question. One thing, you guys, know this. We who study philosophy, we know this. We should know it better, but we have to remind ourselves. Most people don't reject what you're saying because they have answers to your facts. They reject what you're saying because their worldview says you're wrong. Now, there's no backup for their worldview, but they're going to believe it because it's their worldview. So they're going to cite it. Guys, there's no religion in the world that, I'm not an authority in the world religions, as I started saying at the beginning. There's no religion, but I know enough, published some articles. No religion in the world claims to have this kind of evidential backup for what they believe. For most religions, it's a story that they believe to be true, or they may not. I know a lot of the Hindus in India. I know a lot of the Hindus. I'm told by Hindus that they don't even believe their stories are true. historically true. They just think the themes, the ethics, the ideas behind them are true. And if you say to them, this is what they tell me, if you tell them Christian never lived, they may say, who cares? That's their answer. But Christians can't say that about Jesus.
Dr. Gary Habermas, what an honor to have you on here. Thank you so much. And, you've empowered, I see Chris there in Indonesia and Vishal in India and Thomas and others from Egypt. And there are countries, there's Nigerians here with Hanatu and others. These are major Christian leaders. Abraham Agaming is the senior leader for 15,000 churches in Ghana. This is going to really help. Thank you, Gary, so much.
Well, Josh, I'm humbled to do that because I don't know your religious belief and I don't talk to your people. You guys do that. But Christianity, just like in the early church, it's no one person. It has to be carried out. Like I said, God did it. I only talk about it. And you only talk about it. So it's the Holy Spirit who does the work. That's not some kind of pious comment. It's the Holy Spirit. And someone says to me, how do you know the Holy Spirit does it? You know what my answer is? Refute the resurrection. If you tell me why the resurrection is not true, I don't have to believe this anymore. But as long as the resurrection is true, I'll tell you a little story. Mike Lacona, student of mine, published this wonderful work on the resurrection, 750 pages. Best book out right now. The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. It's excellent. It was his doctoral dissertation in South Africa at the University of Pretoria. He and I like to do this little thing when we get questions. We'll get questions from the crowd, and they'll say, well, what about the genocide passages in the Old Testament where God told them to wipe out the native peoples? Or what are the days in Genesis? Or what kind of eschatology do you believe? Or are you a Calvinist or an Arminian, which in our country is probably the hottest of all the issues? And Christians can disagree. But when they ask us those questions in our lectures on the resurrection, here's how we respond. We go, I don't get your point. I mean, I do, but I don't get what you're after. Well, is sovereignty or free will true? Yes. You didn't answer my question. Which view do you take? It's irrelevant. Why? Mike often says, hey, this is a battle, and you're on another mountain. My army's on this mountain. You want to come over here? Because you're in another place. And here's the point we're trying to get at. We're not putting down the Old Testament. We're not putting down the rest of the New Testament. We're not talking about the epistles that we think Paul wrote that the critics don't. We'll take the 7 and make our point. Here's our point. Mike Lacona said this recently. Then he wrote an email to somebody and told him that he got it from me. I don't remember saying this. But Mike said this. At ETS, Josh, when we were given that dialogue on the minimal facts, there were 4 of us dialoguing. And Mike said, if Jesus has been raised from the dead, for you tennis fans, if Jesus has been raised from the dead, then game, set, and match. It's all over. Here's the point. I don't have to know. Listen, talk to Paul Copan about Old Testament genocide. Talk to somebody else about creation. Talk to somebody else about eschatology. I'm going to major on the major, and the reason I do DD Death Resurrection is because I was a skeptic for over 10 years, and I needed to know why Christianity was true, not how to solve little problems. And guys, I say this to PhD students. I hope I don't cause anybody doubts. If I cause people doubts, you go talk to Josh and take his day up talking to him. I'm not trying to cause doubts. But right now, I'm not trying to solve the Old Testament problem. I'm not trying to solve creation. I'm not trying to solve eschatology. If we've got deity, death, resurrection, Christianity is true. That's it. So the guy says to me, how do you answer this? I can say, I don't know. You figure it out. But if Jesus is deity, died on the cross, rose from the dead, Christianity is true. What do you do? The better question is, what are you doing about it? Not how do you solve the ethical problems in ancient Israel. I think they can be solved. That's just not my area. So just remember, if Christ is raised from the dead, game, set, and match. It's all over.